The digital clock on the bedside table flickered to 3 a.m. Alicia lay perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, where moonlight carved long, jagged shadows across the room. The silence in the apartment was not peaceful. It was heavy, pressing against her ears like deep water. She turned her head slowly, the movement deliberate, and stared at the empty side of the bed. The pillow remained untouched, its surface smooth and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth she had expected when she moved to this city. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric, finding no heat, no indentation, no sign that anyone had rested there for days. This was the third night this week that the space beside her had remained vacant. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into her palm, and listened to the distant muffled hum of Seoul outside the window. The city moved on, indifferent to the stillness inside these walls. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. 3 nights. The count echoed in her mind, rhythmic and sharp. Minho had left on Monday morning with a brief nod, his keys clicking against the granite countertop, and he had not returned since. She had checked her phone a dozen times, the screen lighting up the dark room with a harsh, artificial glow, but there were no messages, no missed calls, no explanation for the void he left behind. The pillow beside her was not just empty. It was a pristine, mocking surface that held no memory of his presence. She sat up, the silk sheets sliding against her skin, and stared at the door. Every creak of the building made her muscles tighten, as she waited for the lock to turn. It never did. The routine of his absence was becoming a new, suffocating reality. She turned back to the bed, the untouched pillow staring back at her, and finally accepted that the silence was not an accident. Alicia moved to the vanity, her steps silent on the hardwood floor. She stopped before the mirror, the glass catching the pale light of the dawn beginning to bleed into the room. She stood motionless, her posture rigid, a sharp silhouette against the minimalist decor of the bedroom. Her features were striking, defined by high cheekbones and skin that seemed to absorb the dim light, while her hair was pulled back into a sleek, tight bun that betrayed no sign of the chaos in her thoughts. She stared at her own eyes, searching for a trace of the woman who had arrived in this city months ago. There was none. She lifted a hand, tracing the line of her jaw, feeling the tension locked in her muscles. Outside, the city began to stir, but in the reflection, she saw only the stillness of a woman waiting for a truth. The silence of the room pushed her mind backward, pulling at the threads of a memory she had tried to bury. She remembered the day they met, the way he navigated a crowded room with a focused, singular intensity. He had been a man of sharp movements and precise words, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the city outside. "Seoul is a city of ice," he had said, his voice low and steady. "It is a place that demands everything from you, but I will be your warmth." He had promised to build a wall against the biting wind, to shield her from the relentless pace of the streets, and to create a sanctuary where the cold could never reach. She remembered the way he held her hand, his grip firm, his eyes locked onto hers with a sincerity that felt like an anchor. He had sold her a vision of safety, a promise that she would never have to face the city alone. She closed her eyes, the memory of his voice still vivid, and felt the sharp sting of the present. The warmth he had promised was gone, replaced by a cold that had settled into the very marrow of the house. The reality of that promise dissolved the moment she stepped onto the subway platform. Seoul moved in a synchronized rapid-fire rhythm that she could not match. She stood near the yellow tactile paving, a stationary point in a river of motion. Commuters flowed past her in blurred lines, their faces fixed toward the arriving train, their footsteps echoing in a unified percussive beat. She looked down at her own hands, then back at the crowd. Every person around her was wrapped in the same muted tones, moving with a shared, unspoken intent that excluded her. She was a singular, dark shape against a sea of gray. When the train doors slid open, the surge of people carried her forward. She did not walk. She was pulled by the momentum of the mass. Inside the carriage, she gripped the cold metal pole, her knuckles white. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting a sterile, clinical glare over the rows of seated passengers. None of them looked up. She shifted her weight, trying to find a stable footing, but the train lurched, sending a ripple through the standing crowd. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet the space around her remained empty. She was a ghost in the machine, invisible to the city that now held her captive. She traced the path of her life before Seoul, a map of abandoned territories. There was the desk in her old office, now occupied by someone else. There was the apartment with the sun-drenched balcony where her friends used to gather on Sunday afternoons. She had packed her entire history into 3 suitcases, leaving behind the career she had spent 6 years building, the family dinners that anchored her weeks, and the simple comfort of being understood without speaking. She had traded a life of noise and connection for this sterile, quiet apartment. Every morning she made coffee for 2, but the second cup sat untouched until the liquid turned cold and bitter. Minho was physically present in the house, but he moved through the rooms like a draft of air. He did not leave footprints. He did not engage in the small rhythmic exchanges that define a shared life. She watched him from the doorway as he checked his watch, his movements calculated and distant. He was a ghost in his own home, a man who had retreated behind a wall of silence so thick she could no longer reach him. She had given up everything. The wedding photos sat on the mantel, a collection of frozen, curated moments. In every frame, Minho leaned into the camera with a practiced, wide smile. He held her hand firmly, his posture angled toward the lens to capture the perfect silhouette of a happy couple. The flashes popped in rhythmic bursts, illuminating the ballroom with a harsh, artificial brilliance. She remembered the heat of the lights and the smell of expensive lilies. He was a conductor, and she was the lead instrument in a performance designed for an audience of guests and family. But the moment the final photographer packed his gear and the ballroom doors clicked shut, the transformation began. The light left his eyes. He pulled his hand away, wiped his palms on his trousers, and walked toward the bedroom without looking back. The silence that followed was immediate. He did not speak during the drive home. He did not acknowledge the flowers resting on the back seat. He simply navigated the streets with a rigid, mechanical focus. He was a wall of stone, and she was left standing in the hallway, clutching a bouquet that was already beginning to wilt. The silence in their apartment was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical element that occupied the space. It sat on the furniture like dust. It thickened the air until every breath required a conscious effort to draw. Alicia moved through the living room, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs, but the silence swallowed the sound before it could travel. She stood in the center of the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the only machine that dared to break the stillness. It was a low, mechanical drone that seemed to mock the lack of human conversation. She tried to hum a melody, but the sound felt thin and intrusive. The apartment felt smaller every day, the ceilings pressing down, the corners sharpening into blades. She sat on the sofa and felt the pressure against her chest, a heavy, invisible hand that made it difficult to sit upright. She watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking with a rhythmic, hollow snap. Each second felt like a drop of water hitting a stone floor. Alicia began to test the boundaries of the silence. She started with simple phrases, greetings in Korean practiced until her tongue felt bruised. She would stand in the doorway as he entered, offering a soft word about the weather or the evening meal. He would walk past her, his gaze fixed on the wall behind her head, his pace never faltering. She wondered if the sounds were too foreign, if her accent was a jagged edge that made him recoil. She spent hours with language tapes, refining her vowels, smoothing the cadence of her speech until she could mimic the local rhythm with precision. One evening she spoke a complex sentence, a direct question about his day, clear and deliberate. He stopped. He stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, his back to her, his shoulders rising with a deep, controlled breath. He did not turn. He simply walked into the study and closed the door with a soft, final click. It was not a failure of translation. It was a choice of exclusion. The invitation to dinner arrived like a summons. Alicia sat at the polished table, the wood so dark it mirrored the overhead lights. Across from her, Minho's mother did not speak. She sat with her hands folded, her posture rigid, her eyes moving over Alicia with a slow, mechanical precision. It was not a look of curiosity. It was the gaze of a collector inspecting a specimen for flaws. Alicia shifted in her chair, the leather creaking in the stillness. She tried to catch the woman's eye, to offer a smile, but the gaze never softened. It simply slid over her face. her hair, her hands, as if calculating her value against a standard Alicia could never meet. Every time Alicia reached for her water, she felt those eyes tracking the movement, noting the hesitation in her fingers. The restaurant was filled with the clatter of porcelain and low conversation, but at their table, the air remained stagnant. The mother-in-law tapped a single finger against the table, a rhythmic sound that punctuated the silence. She was not seeing a daughter-in-law. She was seeing a disruption, an anomaly in her carefully curated world. Alicia felt her own skin prickle under that relentless, soundless assessment. The chopsticks felt heavy in Alicia's hand, like tools she had never learned to use. She reached for a piece of steamed vegetable, but her grip faltered. The wood clicked sharply against the ceramic bowl, a sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet room. She froze. Across the table, the mother-in-law did not blink. She merely watched, her expression unchanging, as if waiting for Alicia to commit another error. Alicia tried again, her fingers stiff, her movements deliberate and slow. She felt like a figure in a glass case, placed on a pedestal for silent observation. Every breath she took felt like a performance. She looked at the walls, the art, the polished surfaces, and realized she was the only thing in the room that did not belong. She was an intruder in a museum exhibit, a foreign object that disrupted the perfect sterile harmony of the space. The mother-in-law leaned forward, not to speak, but to better examine the way Alicia held her hands. The scrutiny was absolute. Alicia set the chopsticks down, her palms damp, and stared at the untouched food. She was not there to eat. She was there to be measured, categorized, and ultimately, found wanting. The meal ended without a single word of warmth. A waiter appeared, moving with a practiced, silent grace that seemed to ignore Alicia entirely. While bowing deeply to the mother, he cleared the plates with surgical efficiency, leaving the table bare. Alicia watched the interaction, noting how the staff navigated the space around them like satellites orbiting a fixed point. There was a rhythm to this place, a set of unspoken rules that governed every gesture, every glance, and every silence. She realized then that the pressure she felt was not just coming from the woman across from her. It was baked into the architecture, the lighting, and the way the entire room functioned. Everything was designed to maintain a facade of perfection. She saw a couple at a nearby table, mirroring the same stiff posture, the same avoidance of eye contact, the same heavy, performative stillness. It was a city of carefully constructed barriers. Alicia stood up, her legs feeling leaden. She bowed as she had been taught, a gesture that felt increasingly hollow. The exit was narrow, the air outside already cooling, but the weight followed her. The streets of Seoul were a blur of neon and motion, but Alicia felt like a ghost walking through a film. She bypassed the subway, needing the bite of the wind to clear the sterile air of the restaurant from her lungs. She walked until her feet throbbed, tracing the edges of districts that felt increasingly foreign. Everywhere she looked, people moved with a frantic, rehearsed precision. She paused at a crosswalk, watching a group of professionals laughing in unison. They were performing their roles, just as she was expected to perform hers. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She turned down a narrow alleyway, the sounds of the city fading. When she finally reached their apartment building, the lobby felt like a tomb. She entered the living room, the silence waiting for her like a predator. The apartment was pristine, untouched, and utterly hollow. She sat on the edge of the sofa, watching the clock tick toward midnight, realizing she was waiting for a man who was never truly there. The clock ticked past 3 in the morning. Alicia watched the digital numbers shift, each digit a hammer blow against her resolve. The silence of the apartment had shifted from a heavy weight to a sharp, jagged edge. She stood up, her movements deliberate. She walked to the kitchen and poured the remains of a cold cup of tea into the sink, the liquid splashing with a finality that echoed. She was done waiting for explanations that would never come. She went to the entryway and pulled her keys from the bowl. She did not check her reflection. She did not look back at the empty, perfectly arranged living space that felt more like a showroom. She opened the door, the hallway light spilling across the floor like a challenge. If Minho would not bring his life to her, she would drag the truth out. She stepped into the corridor and pressed the elevator button, her heart beating with a steady, cold rhythm. The uncertainty that had paralyzed her for months evaporated, replaced by a singular, driving need to see what lay behind the wall of his silence. She reached the street level just as the heavy glass doors of the lobby hissed shut behind her. The night air was sharp, smelling of damp concrete and ozone. Alicia retreated into the deep shadow of a concrete pillar, her pulse a steady drum against her ribs. She did not have to wait long. The garage gate groaned open, and Minho's car pulled out, moving with a frantic, jagged speed. That was entirely unlike his usual calculated grace. He did not pause to check the street. He did not signal. He swerved into the lane, his headlights cutting through the darkness like twin blades. Alicia watched the taillights flare as he accelerated, the red glow reflecting in the puddles at her feet. This was not the behavior of a man heading to an office or a late-night business meeting. It was the movement of someone desperate to reach a destination they were terrified of losing. She felt the cold bite of the wind, but she did not shiver. Her focus narrowed to the retreating vehicle, her grip tightening on the keys in her pocket. The hesitation that had held her captive for months dissolved. Alicia pulled into the lane, keeping 2 cars between her and the dark sedan. The city was a blur of neon, the vibrant blues and pinks of shop signs reflecting off the rain-slicked asphalt. She kept her headlights dimmed, relying on the ambient glow of the streetlights to track him. Every time he tapped his brakes, her own heart skipped a beat, the distance between them feeling like a fragile thread. At a major intersection, the signal turned amber. Minho accelerated, cutting through the cross-traffic with reckless disregard. Alicia hesitated for a fraction of a second, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel, before she floored the pedal to follow. She narrowly missed a delivery scooter, the driver shouting as she swerved into the turn. The adrenaline surged, sharp and metallic. She regained her position, keeping the sedan in sight as they wove through the tightening grid of the city center. The skyscrapers loomed overhead, their windows like unblinking eyes watching her progress. She was no longer a passenger in her own life. She was the hunter. The neon glow of the city center began to thin, replaced by the harsh, flickering yellow of sodium streetlights. Alicia kept her distance, watching the sedan navigate the complex interchanges. She expected him to veer toward the business district, the glass towers where he spent his days. Instead, he stayed in the far lane, accelerating as the traffic thinned. He ignored the exit for the office park, his car cutting a straight line toward the dark periphery of the city. Alicia checked her mirrors. The road behind her was empty. The road ahead was a widening expanse of shadow. The familiar landmarks fell away, replaced by industrial warehouses and rusted fencing. The air grew colder, vibrating through the frame. Minho was not heading for a bar or a colleague's home. He was driving toward the void where the city ended. Every mile they put between themselves and the city felt like a bridge burning behind them. She was following a man who was no longer the person she thought she knew. The pavement ended abruptly, giving way to a narrow, rain-slicked track of gravel and mud. Minho's sedan slowed, its tires spraying grit against the undercarriage. Alicia eased off the accelerator, the sound of her own engine suddenly too loud in the oppressive silence of the countryside. Rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets, blurring the windshield and turning the path ahead into a dark, treacherous ribbon. She lost sight of his taillights for a heart-stopping moment as the road curved sharply around a dense thicket of pines. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles aching, and steered into the darkness, guided only by the faint, rhythmic pulse of his brake lights flickering through the downpour. The terrain grew steep. Her tires spun briefly on the slick mud before finding purchase. The trees thinned, revealing an expanse of overgrown land. Ahead, the path straightened, leading toward a high, weathered wall. Behind it, the silhouette of a traditional villa rose from the mist. Alicia cut her own lights, letting the darkness swallow her car, and stared at the isolated structure. The journey had reached its end. Alicia killed her engine. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the relentless drumming of rain against the roof. She waited, counting the seconds, until the sound of Minho's car door slamming echoed through the valley. She moved quickly, stepping out into the downpour. The mud sucked at her boots, threatening to pull her down with every stride. She kept low, her body angled toward the perimeter of the property. A rough stone wall emerged from the gloom, its surface slick with moss and rainwater. She reached it, pressing her palms against the freezing rock, and peered over the jagged edge. Minho stood near the heavy wooden gate. He did not look back. He did not check his surroundings. He moved with a strange, mechanical purpose, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Alicia held her breath, her chest tight, watching him reach into his pocket for a key. The metal glinted briefly in the dim light. He stood before the entrance, a solitary figure dwarfed by the massive, ancient structure. He moved as if he were being watched. The heavy wooden gate groaned, a long, low sound that vibrated through the damp air. It swung inward, not with the ease of modern hinges, but with the resistance of something long forgotten. Alicia watched from the shadows of the wall as the barrier parted. Beyond it lay a courtyard paved in uneven river stones, slick with the persistent rain. The air inside the perimeter felt different, thicker, colder, and smelling of damp earth and ancient pine. It was as if she had crossed a threshold into a different world, one where the rules of the city she knew no longer applied. Minho stepped inside, his silhouette swallowed by the deeper darkness of the interior garden. He did not look back. The gate remained slightly ajar, a dark invitation swaying in the wind. Alicia waited, her pulse hammering against her throat, until the silence returned to the courtyard. She pushed away from the stone wall, her boots finding purchase on the wet ground. She moved toward the opening, her hand brushing the rough, splintered wood of the gate. She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and stepped across the threshold. Alicia stood in the center of the courtyard, the rain still clinging to her skin. Her legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself were trying to hold her back. A sharp, jagged thought pierced her resolve. What if she found another woman inside? The image of Minho with someone else, a secret life hidden behind these ancient walls, made her stomach turn. She took a half step toward the exit, her hand reaching for the gate to pull it shut and walk away forever. But the silence of the villa was too loud to ignore. It was a vacuum, pulling her toward the truth. She realized that the pain of not knowing was already destroying her from the inside out. She gripped her hands into fists, forcing her knuckles to turn white, and steadied her breathing. The fear of what she might find was eclipsed by the desperate need to know why she had been kept in the dark for so long. She turned her back on the gate. She looked toward the main structure, where a single, dim light flickered in an upper window. She took one step, then another, her boots crunching softly on the wet stones. There was no going back now. The truth was waiting. Alicia reached the main entrance, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold, polished wood. She expected a lock, a barrier, a final defense against her intrusion. Instead, the door yielded with a soft, almost imperceptible click. It swung open just enough to reveal a sliver of the interior. She hesitated, her breath hitching as she peered into the gloom. The air that drifted out hit her instantly. It was not the scent of incense or tea, but a sharp, clinical tang of antiseptic that burned the back of her throat. Beneath that, the heavy, stale odor of old wood and trapped dust clung to the air. She pushed the door wider, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped over the threshold, her boots silent on the smooth floorboards. The transition was jarring. Outside, the rain lashed against the roof, a chaotic, rhythmic roar. Inside, the silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. She stood in the foyer, her eyes adjusting to the dim, amber light filtering from down the hall. Every shadow seemed to stretch, reaching toward her from the corners of the room. She took a tentative step forward, the floorboards groaning under her weight, and realized with a jolt that this place was not a home, but a tomb of secrets. Alicia moved deeper into the corridor, her hand trailing along the wall. The wood felt unnaturally smooth, polished to a dull sheen that caught no light. A rhythmic, metallic clicking echoed from somewhere ahead, steady and precise. It was a sound that did not belong in a traditional villa. She froze, her pulse thrumming in her ears, as she strained to identify the source. It was the distinct, hollow beep of a heart rate monitor, muffled by heavy sliding doors. She crept forward, her feet barely touching the floor. To her left, a cart sat abandoned in the shadows, laden with sterile gauze, plastic tubing, and glass vials. The sight turned her blood cold. This was no private retreat. The air here was thinner, recycled and chilled by hidden vents. She pushed past a heavy curtain, her fingers brushing against a metal IV stand that rattled with a sharp, jarring clatter. The sound seemed to scream in the silence. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat as she realized the truth. The entire wing had been converted into a clinical ward. Every shadow now held the weight of a hidden life, and the mechanical pulse ahead was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Alicia leaned against the wall, her palms damp and sliding against the polished wood. The world seemed to tilt. Every breath she took felt shallow, snatched from the stagnant air. Her vision blurred at the edges, the hallway stretching and contracting with the rhythm of her erratic heartbeat. She tried to steady her hands, but they betrayed her, trembling violently as she reached out to steady herself against a doorframe. The floor felt uneven beneath her feet, shifting like a deck at sea. She took a step, but her balance faltered, her shoulder clipping the wall with a dull thud that echoed through the narrow space. She squeezed her eyes shut, counting to 3, trying to force the spinning room into focus. When she opened them, the hallway appeared fractured. She pushed off the wall, her gait uneven and hurried, her body reacting to a primal need to flee. Alicia planted her heels into the floorboards, forcing the world to stop its spinning. The silence returned, heavy and absolute, pressing against her eardrums. She turned her head, following the faint, golden luminescence that bled into the corridor from a room just ahead. Her feet moved of their own accord, silent on the polished wood. She reached the door, finding it pushed open by a mere 3 inches. A sliver of warm, artificial light cut across the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. She pressed her face toward the gap, her breath hitching as she caught the scent of antiseptic and stale flowers. The glow from within was steady, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching fingers. She gripped the edge of the doorframe, her knuckles turning white, the wood biting into her skin. Inside, the room was bathed in a soft, amber haze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. She stood at the threshold, paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming certainty. Alicia pushed the door just enough to widen her view. The room was small, clinical, and filled with the hum of a medical monitor. Min-ho was there. He was not standing, not pacing, and not wearing the sharp, rigid posture she saw every morning. He was on his knees beside a narrow bed. His back was to her, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of years of exhaustion. His hands were busy, but not with a phone or a document. He held a frail, pale hand in both of his thumbs tracing slow, repetitive circles. He leaned his forehead against the edge of the mattress, his eyes closed. The tension that usually defined his face had vanished. He whispered something, his voice a low vibration. He adjusted the blanket, pulling it higher with a deliberate, protective motion. Alicia watched his fingers, noting the way they lingered on the fabric, a gesture of profound, aching care. He remained motionless. The sight of him, stripped of his usual defensive shell, made Alicia forget to breathe. She stood in the shadows, her hand hovering near the frame. Alicia shifted her weight, the floorboards beneath her feet remaining silent. She needed to see the face. The woman in the bed stirred, a slow, labored movement that drew Minho's attention back to her. As the woman turned her head toward the light, the air in the room seemed to thin. Alicia's breath caught in her throat. The woman's features were a mirror image of the man kneeling beside her. The same sharp, defined jawline, the same high, prominent cheekbones, and the same deep-set eyes, though hers were clouded by illness. It was not a stranger, it was a reflection. The woman looked like a female version of Minho, aged by pain and isolation. Alicia gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. Minho smoothed the hair back from the woman's forehead, his touch lingering with a familiar, protective rhythm. Alicia stared at the two of them, the man and the woman, their profiles aligned in the soft amber glow. The truth of their connection hit her. Alicia stepped further into the room, her eyes scanning the periphery. Beside the bed, a metal trolley held a stack of medical charts and vials. She caught a glimpse of a diagnostic report clipped to the edge, the text dense with technical terms and a specific genetic marker highlighted in red. The woman's breathing was shallow, assisted by a rhythmic pump that pulsed with a low, mechanical hum. This was not a hospital. It was a private, sequestered ward. Alicia looked at the walls, bare of photographs, calendars, or any sign of a life lived outside these four corners. The woman's skin was pale, her limbs thin and still, showing the long-term effects of a condition that required constant, hidden maintenance. Alicia understood then why the house was a fortress. In a family obsessed with status and public image, a genetic defect was not a tragedy to be shared. It was a stain to be erased. Minho's mother had looked through Alicia at dinner because she was only ever a temporary fixture, a distraction from the real work of maintaining this silence. The woman in the bed was not just a sister. She was a living, breathing secret that threatened the foundation of the family name. Every cold glance, every late night, and every wall Minho built was designed to keep this room from the world. Minho did not speak. He moved with a mechanical precision, adjusting the IV drip and smoothing the sheets with hands that never shook. He stood up, walked to the door, and checked the lock, his eyes scanning the hallway before he turned back to the bed. It was a practiced, habitual motion. Alicia watched him from the shadows of the doorway. He was not just caring for his sister. He was guarding a perimeter. Every movement he made was calculated to avoid detection, a performance of absolute control. He sat back down, his shoulders hunched, his face a mask of iron. Alicia saw the tension in his jaw, the way he braced himself against the weight of the secret he carried. He had built a fortress around his life, and he was the primary prisoner. His coldness toward her, the distance he maintained, and the silence he enforced were not personal slights. They were the bricks of a wall designed to keep the world away from this room. He was a man living in a state of constant, silent siege, sacrificing his own life to preserve a reputation that demanded total erasure of the truth. He was the warden of his own shame, and every day was a battle to keep the gates closed. The pieces locked into place with a sickening, sharp clarity. Alicia stood frozen, the air in the room feeling thin. Why her? She was an outsider, a woman from across the ocean with no ties to the local social circles, no family to gossip, and no history in this city to cross-reference his lies. She was the perfect blind spot. He had not married her for companionship or a future. He had married her for her ignorance. Every time she had asked about his work, he had deflected with a smile. Every time she had tried to integrate into his world, he had erected barriers. She was a prop in his elaborate stage play, a foreigner who would never understand the nuances of the family's hidden shame. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was not a partner. She was a security measure, a clean slate. He could keep in the dark while he tended to the ghosts of his past. She had been a tool, used to maintain a lie. Alicia shifted her weight. A single floorboard groaned under her heel, a sharp, dry sound that cut through the heavy air of the villa. The sound was small, but in the confined space, it acted like a gunshot. Minho stopped mid-motion. He did not look up immediately. He froze, his hand still hovering over the bedsheets, his posture rigid as stone. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His eyes met hers. The mask of iron he had worn for years vanished in a heartbeat. His face contorted, the skin pulling tight across his cheekbones, his mouth hanging slightly open in a silent gasp of pure horror. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and exposed. He looked at her, then back at the bed, then back at her, his eyes darting as if searching for an exit that did not exist. He was caught. The performance was over. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a chasm. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, but he did not move toward her. He stood rooted, his hands trembling at his sides, the reality of his exposure settling over him like a shroud. He was no longer the warden, he was the prisoner. Minho did not speak. His breath hitched, a ragged sound that failed to fill the room. Alicia did not look away from him, but her peripheral vision caught the movement on the bed. The sheets shifted. A thin, pale hand gripped the edge of the mattress, the knuckles white and protruding. Slowly, with a mechanical stiffness, the woman on the bed turned her head. Her movement was labored, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic hiss of an oxygen machine. As she faced the doorway, her eyes locked onto Alicia. They were wide, clouded by years of dim light and confinement, yet they held a piercing, hollow clarity. There was no recognition in that stare, only the raw, unfiltered weight of a lifetime spent in shadows. Alicia felt the air leave her lungs. The woman's skin was paper-thin, stretched over bone, and her gaze traveled from Alicia's face to the door behind her, searching for a world she had not seen in decades. The silence in the room deepened, no longer defined by Minho's deception, but by the presence of the person he had erased. Alicia stepped forward, the floorboards cold beneath her feet. She did not look at Minho. She focused entirely on the sister, witnessing the reality of the secret. Minho stepped forward, his hands outstretched as if to catch a falling object. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound emerged. He tried again, his voice cracking. "Alicia, you don't understand. It is not what you think." Alicia did not blink. She watched his fingers twitch, the desperate, frantic energy of a man whose world had just collapsed. She looked past him to the medical monitors, the steady, blinking green lines pulsing in the dim room. The truth was not in his words. It was in the sterile smell of antiseptic and the heavy, stagnant air of the villa. She reached out and touched the edge of the bed frame. The metal was cold. She turned her gaze back to Minho, who had stopped mid-sentence, his face a mask of defeat. He looked small, stripped of the authority he wore like armor in the city. Alicia did not offer him a response. She simply looked at him, then at the woman on the bed, and finally at the door. The weight of the secret had crushed the foundation of their life together. She took a single, deliberate step backward, her boots clicking against the hard floor. The silence was absolute, heavier than any confession he could have manufactured. She turned her back on him and walked toward the exit, leaving the room, the secret, and the man behind. The heavy door of the villa swung shut, muffling the sound of Minho's voice. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the gravel path into a slick, dark mirror. Alicia walked through the downpour, the water soaking through her hair and skin, washing away the stagnant air of the room she had just left. She reached the stone gate pillar and stopped. Her hand moved to her left ring finger. She pulled the band off, the metal cold and tight against her skin. She placed it carefully on the flat surface of the gate, a small silver circle against the dark, wet stone. She did not look back. She walked toward the main road, where the distant, rhythmic hum of the city began to rise above the sound of the rain. Her pace was steady, rhythmic, and unhurried. She crossed the threshold of the villa grounds, moving into the dim, gray light of the... She reached the curb and flagged down a passing taxi, her movements precise and final. As the car pulled away, she watched the villa disappear into the mist, leaving the secret and the man behind in the silence of the outskirts. The taxi pulled up to the terminal entrance. Alicia stepped out onto the wet pavement, the airport lights reflecting in the puddles at her feet. She walked through the sliding glass doors, the air inside dry and climate-controlled. She approached the counter, handed over her passport, and watched the agent process the ticket. There was no hesitation in her movements. She walked toward the departure gate, passing rows of travelers who were moving in the opposite direction. She stopped at a trash bin near the boarding area. She pulled her phone from her pocket, deleted the contact for the apartment, and dropped the device into the bin. It hit the bottom with a hollow thud. She walked to the gate and joined the line of passengers. When the attendant scanned her boarding pass, she stepped onto the jet bridge. She found her seat by the window and buckled the belt. The plane lifted, the ground fell away, and she leaned her head against the glass. She was finally moving toward a place where she was not a secret. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft, artificial glow. Alicia watched the horizon line shift from deep indigo to a thin, sharp band of gold as the sun climbed above the clouds. Below, the world was obscured by a thick, white blanket, erasing the city and the life she had just abandoned. She unbuckled her seatbelt and shifted, stretching her legs into the narrow aisle space. The hum of the engines remained constant, a steady vibration that resonated through the seat and into her spine. She reached for the small plastic cup of water provided by the attendant, her fingers steady as she lifted it to her lips. She took a slow sip, the cool liquid grounding her in the present moment. There were no more expectations to meet, no more hidden rooms to navigate, and no more secrets to carry. She pulled a blanket over her shoulders, tucked her hands beneath it, and leaned her head back against the headrest. She watched the light play across the curved wall of the fuselage. The plane banked slightly, turning toward a new trajectory. She closed her eyes. The descent began with a sharp tilt of the floorboards. Alicia felt the pressure change in her ears as the plane dropped through the cloud layer. Below, the landscape sharpened into focus, a grid of streets and buildings that held no history for her. The landing gear deployed with a heavy, metallic thud. She gripped the armrests as the wheels struck the tarmac, the sudden deceleration pulling her forward against the belt. The engines roared into reverse thrust. She stood up, retrieved her bag from the overhead bin, and moved into the aisle. She walked through the terminal, her footsteps echoing. She passed the customs checkpoint, handed over her documents, and stepped through the final set of doors. The air outside was different, crisp, unfamiliar. She walked toward the taxi stand, her pace steady and rhythmic. She signaled a car, climbed into the back seat. She watched the airport terminal disappear in the rearview mirror. She looked at her hands, empty of rings, and turned her gaze toward the road ahead. The journey was over. Her life was hers again. The taxi pulled to a stop in front of a small, quiet apartment building. Alicia paid the driver, stepped onto the sidewalk, and looked up at the darkened windows. She carried her single bag up the stairs, the wood creaking under her weight. Inside the room, she set the bag on the floor and pulled the zipper open. She took out a few essentials, placing them on the small wooden desk by the window. She walked to the kitchen area, filled a glass with water, and drank it slowly while looking out at the city skyline. The lights of the city were distant and unfamiliar, a grid of amber and white that belonged to no one she knew. She walked back to the bed, smoothed the sheets with her palms, and sat down. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of a refrigerator in the corner. She stood up, walked to the wall, and flicked the light switch. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the soft glow from the street lamps outside. She climbed into bed, pulled the covers up, and lay still. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of her own breathing in the quiet space. She was finally, completely, at rest. The morning sun cut a sharp line across the floor, pulling Alicia from sleep. She sat up, the silence of the room no longer heavy, but clear. She stood, walked to the desk, and packed the few items she had laid out the night before. The zipper of her bag clicked shut, a final sound in the quiet apartment. She walked to the door, turned the handle, and stepped into the hallway. The stairs felt solid under her feet as she descended to the street level. Outside, the city was waking up. She joined the flow of people moving toward the subway, her pace matching the steady rhythm of the morning commute. She did not look back at the building. She navigated the crowded sidewalk with purpose, weaving through the gaps in the crowd. She reached the station entrance, paused for a moment, to watch the trains arrive and depart, then descended the steps. She stood on the platform, waiting for the doors to open. When the train arrived, she stepped inside, found a seat, and looked out the window as the tunnel lights blurred into a streak of motion. She was moving forward. The airport terminal was a vast expanse of glass and polished stone. Alicia walked toward the International Departures Board, her eyes scanning the list of destinations. She found her flight, moved to the check-in counter, and placed her passport on the scanner. The agent checked her documents, printed a boarding pass, and handed it back with a nod. She took it, walked toward the security checkpoint, and placed her bag on the belt. She stepped through the metal detector, gathered her belongings, and moved toward the gate. The terminal hummed with the sound of departures. She sat in the waiting area, watching the planes taxi onto the runway. When the gate agent called her group, she stood up, walked to the scanner, and tapped her pass. She moved down the jet bridge, the air growing cooler as she approached the aircraft. She found her seat, buckled the belt, and looked out the window. The plane pushed back from the gate, engines rising to a steady roar. She watched the city of Seoul shrink into a grid of lights below. The horizon opened up, wide and clear. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the weight of the past fall away. She was finally free. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft, artificial twilight as the aircraft leveled off. Alicia reached up and adjusted the air vent, letting the cool stream of air hit her face. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, opened it to a blank page, and clicked her pen. The engine drone turned into a steady, rhythmic hum that filled the space around her. She looked out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below, glowing in the high-altitude sun. The city she left behind was now thousands of miles away, hidden beneath a layer of mist. She wrote a single word at the top of the page, then set the pen down. She watched the horizon, where the blue of the sky met the deep dark of space. There was no more waiting, no more silence to endure, and no more secrets to carry. She shifted in her seat, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. She was not running away anymore. She was moving towards something she had not yet defined. She closed her eyes, listened to the steady pulse of the plane, and breathed in the quiet air. The journey was hers now, and for the first time, the path ahead was completely clear. The descent began with a slight dip in the air, followed by the mechanical whine of landing gear locking into place. Alicia watched the ground rise to meet the wheels, the landscape shifting from vast ocean to the textured grid of a new city. The plane touched down with a heavy thud, tires screeching against the tarmac before the engines slowed to a low rumble. She waited for the seatbelt sign to chime, then stood up and reached into the overhead bin for her bag. She moved into the aisle, joining the line of passengers heading toward the exit. The cabin door opened, letting in the sharp, unfamiliar air. She stepped onto the jet bridge, her boots clicking against the metal floor. She walked past the gate, through the terminal, and out into the main arrival hall. The space was bright, filled with the noise of people greeting one another in a language she did not yet speak. She walked toward the glass doors leading to the street. She pushed them open, felt the wind on her face, and stepped into the sunlight. She was no longer waiting for anyone. She was exactly where she needed to be. The city air smelled of rain and distant coffee. Alicia stood on the curb, watching the taxis weave through the morning traffic. She checked her watch, not to see what time it was, but to confirm that every second from this point forward belonged only to her. She walked past the line of waiting cars and headed toward the train station. Her boots struck the pavement with a steady, rhythmic cadence. She navigated the crowded sidewalk, weaving through the throng of commuters without looking back. She reached the ticket kiosk, scanned the map, and tapped the screen to select a destination she had never visited before. The machine printed a small, crisp slip of paper. She took it, tucked it into her pocket, and turned toward the platform. The train pulled in, its brakes hissing against the tracks. She stepped through the sliding doors as they parted. She found a seat by the window, placed her bag on the floor, and watched the station platform slide away. The train rattled over the tracks, a steady vibration that traveled through the seat and into her bones. Alicia watched the urban sprawl give way to open fields, the gray concrete replaced by vibrant greens and browns. She pulled the ticket from her pocket, turning the paper over in her fingers. It was just a small piece of cardstock, yet it held the weight of her entire history. She thought of the apartment in Seoul, the cold pillow, and the stone-faced man who had kept his life in a locked room. Those memories no longer felt like a cage. They were simply a chapter she had finished reading. She stood as the train began to slow, the brakes emitting a low, metallic groan. The doors slid open, revealing a platform bathed in the warm, unfiltered light. She stepped out, the air here crisp and smelling of pine. She walked toward the exit, her pace unhurried and deliberate. She was not running away anymore. She was simply walking toward a life that was entirely her own, step by steady step. The road ended at a high cliff, overlooking the sea. Alicia walked to the edge, the salt spray rising to meet her. She reached into her pocket one last time, pulling out the small silver key to the apartment she would never return to. She held it for a moment, feeling the cold metal against her palm, and then tossed it into the churning surf below. It vanished without a sound. The wind whipped around her, pulling at her hair, but she did not flinch. She stood tall, breathing in the vast open air. The silence that once felt like a prison now felt like space, room to breathe, room to grow, room to be someone entirely new. She turned away from the cliff and began the long walk down the winding path toward the beach. Her shadow stretched long and thin across the sand. She was no longer a wife, a cover, or an outsider. She was simply Alicia. She walked until the land met the water, her footprints marking the only path that mattered. The sun hung high, casting a path of light across the waves. She stepped into the light, leaving the weight of the past behind, and kept walking. The tide pulled back, leaving the sand smooth and reflective under the afternoon sun. Alicia stopped where the wet earth met the dry, the rhythmic pulse of the ocean grounding her. She unclasped the watch from her wrist, the one he had given her for their first anniversary, and set it on a flat stone. It was a mechanical object, ticking away seconds that no longer belonged to her. She left it there, a relic of a life built on shadows. She turned back to the water, watching the waves break and reform. The horizon was a clean, unbroken line, free of the expectations that had once defined her every movement. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with the sharp, clean scent of brine. Her pulse was steady, her mind was clear. She began to walk again, her stride lengthening as she moved toward the edge of the world. She did not look back at the stone. She did not look back at the path she had traveled. She walked until the water swirled around her ankles, cold and bracing. She stood there, watching the light shift across the surface, finally at peace with the silence. She was home, not in a place, but in herself. The water receded, leaving behind a mirror of sky on the wet sand. Alicia watched the reflection, seeing not a wife or an outsider, but a woman standing on her own terms. The silence of the ocean was different from the silence of the apartment. It was vast, open, and full of possibility. She reached down, picked up a smooth stone, and felt its weight, a simple, grounding reality. She tossed it into the deep, watching the ripples spread. The past was a closed chapter, a story she had finished writing. She turned away from the shoreline, her path clear and unburdened. Every step forward was hers alone. She did not need a destination to know she was finally moving in the right direction. The horizon widened, the light shifted, and she walked into the day, fully present and entirely free. Her journey had led her here, to this moment of absolute clarity. She was no longer waiting for a door to open. She was the one holding the key. If you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel.